An unpredictable horse interrupts a luxurious celebration, turning chaos into a mystery. What it attempts to reveal could forever change the fates hidden under the party's glimmer. The lights sparkled over the garden of the mansion in Aspen, creating a spectacle worthy of a fairy tale. Elizabeth Thompson watched the guests arriving in their luxurious cars while adjusting her navy blue silk dress for the 10th time, a dress she had chosen especially for that night. Her 30th birthday had to be perfect. Like everything that bore the Thompson name, the main hall gleamed with arrangements of rare orchids brought from different parts of the world. The chamber orchestra played compositions by Mozart, while waiters circulated with glasses of French champagne. At the center of the hall, a 6-tiered cake adorned with edible gold leaf represented all the opulence her family had built over generations. But something was wrong. Elizabeth couldn't explain it, but she felt a growing unease in her chest. Perhaps it was the way her Uncle Richard observed every detail of the party, with a strange smile, or how some guests whispered in dark corners of the hall. The feeling had haunted her since morning, when she had found her jewelry box disheveled, even though she was certain she had left it in perfect order. "Elizabeth, darling." The shrill voice of her Aunt Margaret brought her back to reality. "You look stunning, but why that face? It's your birthday. You should be radiant." "I'm fine, Auntie." Elizabeth forced a smile, accepting yet another, obligatory hug. Her eyes wandered across the hall, pausing for a moment on a young man she didn't recognize, discreetly taking notes in a small notebook. The sound of hooves on marble came before anyone could react. Shadow, her majestic black horse, appeared like a specter in the middle of the main hall. Guests screamed, glasses shattered, and chaos erupted as the animal, normally so serene, began to neigh furiously. "Someone control that beast," shouted Richard, his face red with anger. But Elizabeth had known Shadow since she was a girl. Something was wrong. The horse had never acted like this before. Within seconds, the monumental cake crashed to the ground, scattering across the Italian marble floor. Flowers were trampled, and the orchestra stopped playing abruptly. Shadow kept his eyes fixed on Elizabeth, as if trying to communicate something urgent. "Calm down, Shadow." Elizabeth approached slowly, ignoring the protests of the guests. The horse immediately quieted at the sound of her voice, but his eyes remained restless. It was then that she noticed there were fresh dirt marks on Shadow's hooves, but he was supposed to be in the stable, which had special rubber flooring. Someone had taken him out of there before he appeared in the hall. "This is unacceptable." Richard's voice cut through the silence that followed. "How could an animal be loose during a party of this caliber? I want all the stable staff fired immediately." "No," Elizabeth protested. "First, we need to understand what happened." Among the guests recovering from the shock, Elizabeth noticed a face she hadn't expected to see. Gabriel, her ex-fiancé, was observing the scene with peculiar interest. Their eyes met for a moment, and he flashed a smile that made her shiver. "I need to check the stables," Elizabeth said, already heading toward the exit of the hall. She ignored her aunt's calls and Richard's protests about her absence at the party. The path to the stables had never felt so long. The night was strangely quiet, except for the sound of her heels on the gravel and the distant murmur of the party. The stable lights were on, which was unusual at that hour. As she approached Shadow's stall, Elizabeth felt her heart race. The door was open, and there were marks of dirt scattered on the floor. Near the entrance, a crumpled piece of paper caught her attention. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded it. "Not everything is as it seems," the message read, in handwriting she didn't recognize. The sound of footsteps on the gravel made her turn quickly. A shadow moved at the entrance of the stables, disappearing before she could identify it. Elizabeth tucked the note into the small bag she carried, feeling that the night was far from over. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us which city you're watching from, and let's continue. Upon returning to the party, Elizabeth noticed that something had changed in the atmosphere. The smiles seemed more forced, the glances more intense. Traces of the earlier chaos were still visible, staff discreetly cleaning up the remains of the cake from the floor, while others rearranged the knocked-over flowers. Shadow had been taken back to the stables by one of the handlers, but his presence still lingered in the air like an omen. Where were you? Richard's voice sounded close to her ear, making her jump. Your guests are asking for the birthday girl. I needed to check how Shadow escaped, Elizabeth replied, studying her uncle's expression. There was something different in his eyes, a tension she had never noticed before. Don't worry about that now. I've called a vet to examine him tomorrow, Richard said, gripping her arm with a strength masked by a smile. Come, there are important people who want to discuss the company's new projects. Elizabeth let herself be guided through the hall, automatically greeting whomever Richard introduced. Her mind was on the crumpled note she had found at the stables. Not everything is as it seems. The words echoed in her head like a warning. It was then that she noticed Gabriel talking to a group of executives. He had changed since the last time she saw him, 2 years ago. He was thinner, with premature grey streaks at his temples. His eyes, however, still held that calculating glint that had unsettled her so much at the end of their relationship. Elizabeth, he approached, leaving the group behind. You look stunning. What are you doing here, Gabriel? I don't recall inviting you. I came to apologize. He lowered his voice, leaning slightly closer. What happened between us? I was wrong. I was immature and ambitious. Before she could respond, Elizabeth noticed Richard discreetly stepping away, his phone pressed to his ear. Something about his posture intrigued her. He seemed tense, constantly glancing over his shoulder. Excuse me, she murmured to Gabriel, following in the direction of her uncle. She kept enough distance to avoid being noticed, partially hiding, behind a column decorated with climbing vines. It has to be tonight, Richard whispered into the phone. We can't wait any longer. If she finds out... There was a pause. No. Make sure nothing interferes with the plans tonight. We've already had too many problems with that horse. Elizabeth's heart raced. The mention of Shadow couldn't be a coincidence. She took a few steps back, bumping into someone. Sorry, she said automatically, turning to find the young man she had seen earlier with the notebook. Miss Thompson, he smiled, handing her a card. Nathan Carter, from the Globe. May I have a moment? I don't give interviews during private events, she replied curtly, trying to walk away. Even if it's about the irregularities in the Thompson companies. His voice was low, but every word rang clear as a bell. I have documents showing suspicious transactions over the past few months, all approved by Mr. Richard. Elizabeth felt her blood run cold. The words from the note came back with full force. Not everything is as it seems. Meet me in the library in 20 minutes, she whispered, before quickly walking away. The library was in the west wing of the mansion, far from the buzz of the party. It had been her refuge since childhood, with shelves stretching from floor to ceiling, filled with old volumes and first editions. The smell of leather and aged paper always calmed her, but that night, even the familiar surroundings couldn't ease her anxiety. As she waited, she approached one of the shelves. Her fingers automatically ran along the spines of the books until they stopped at a specific volume, History of the Great Paulista Families. As she pulled it out, she noticed it was heavier than it should be. The middle pages were glued together, forming an improvised compartment. With trembling hands, Elizabeth carefully opened the hidden compartment inside the book. A series of yellow documents fell onto the solid oak table. They were contracts, receipts, and handwritten notes dating back 3 years, exactly when her father had stepped down from the presidency of the companies for a sabbatical that still hadn't ended. I see you started without me, Nathan said, quietly closing the library door behind him. His gaze fell on the scattered papers on the table. How did you know about these documents? Elizabeth asked, studying every move the journalist made. Actually, I didn't, he replied, approaching cautiously. But I have others, very similar to these. Nathan removed a brown envelope from his jacket. Your uncle has been very careless lately, perhaps out of haste, perhaps out of overconfidence. As they examined the documents side by side, a dark story began to unfold. There were records of shell companies opened in Caribbean countries, multi-million-dollar transfers to numbered accounts in Switzerland, and consulting contracts with astronomical figures for services never rendered. This explains the board's strange behavior over the past few months, Elizabeth murmured, connecting the dots. But I still don't understand how my father allowed this to happen. Maybe he didn't allow it, Nathan suggested, pointing to a specific document. Look at the date on this power of attorney. It was signed a day before your father left for his trip. Elizabeth examined the signature closely. Something seemed off. After years of working alongside her father, she knew his handwriting like the back of her hand. The final stroke, a characteristic flourish he always made, was different. This is a forgery, she concluded, feeling her heart tighten. But why? Why would my father just disappear without... A noise from the hallway interrupted her. Footsteps were approaching. Quickly, Elizabeth and Nathan gathered the documents, returning them to the hidden compartment in the book. They barely had time to step away from the table when the door opened. "Ah, I was looking for you." It was Gabriel, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Your aunt is worried about your absence at the party." "I was just showing Mr. Carter the library," Elizabeth replied, keeping her voice steady. "He's a great admirer of rare books." "Journalist and bibliophile?" Gabriel raised an eyebrow. What an interesting combination. The way he pronounced journalist made Elizabeth shiver. There was a tone of recognition in his voice, as if he already knew exactly who Nathan was. "If you'll excuse me," Nathan said, exchanging a meaningful glance with Elizabeth before leaving. "I didn't know you had an interest in reporters now," Gabriel commented casually, moving closer to where she stood. His eyes wandered over the shelves, pausing for a moment on the book that held the documents. "People change, Gabriel. You should know that." Elizabeth took a step toward the door. "I need to get back to the party." "Wait." He held her arm, gently but firmly. "There's something I need to tell you about your father." Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. "What do you know about my father?" "Not here." Gabriel glanced nervously at the door. "Meet me in the Winter Garden in half an hour, and Elizabeth..." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Don't trust the journalist. He's not who he says he is." Before she could question him, Gabriel quickly left the library, leaving her alone with her doubts. Through the window, Elizabeth could see the guests mingling in the illuminated garden, their laughter and conversations muffled by the distance. They seemed to belong to another world, oblivious to the whirlwind of revelations she was experiencing. A familiar whinny caught her attention. Shadow was restless again, shifting in his stall, as if sensing something. Elizabeth knew she should return to the party, keep up appearances, smile, and thank everyone for coming. But the discoveries of that night changed everything. Who was really telling the truth? Nathan, with his documented evidence. Gabriel, with his mysterious hints. Or were there even more layers to this plot that she hadn't even begun to unravel? The Winter Garden was a majestic structure of glass and wrought iron, built by her grandfather as a birthday gift for her grandmother. During the day, it was a paradise of rare orchids and exotic ferns. At night, with strategically placed lighting, it transformed into an almost magical setting. Elizabeth arrived a few minutes before the agreed time with Gabriel. She needed this moment of solitude to gather her thoughts. The discoveries in the library still echoed in her mind, along with her ex-fiancé's cryptic words about Nathan. A movement among the plants caught her attention. "Gabriel?" "Not yet." The voice that responded was feminine. Eleanor, the housekeeper who had worked for the family for over 30 years, emerged from the shadows. "Forgive me for startling you." "Miss Elizabeth, but I need to give you something." Eleanor had always been more than an employee. She had been a constant presence in Elizabeth's life since her birth, almost like a second mother after the disappearance of her biological mother when she was still a baby. "What is it, Eleanor? You look pale." The housekeeper glanced around nervously before handing Elizabeth a yellowed envelope. "Your father asked me to keep this. He said I would know the right time to deliver it. When I saw Shadow crashing the party today, I remembered his words. When the black horse brings chaos, it will be time to reveal the truth." Elizabeth felt her hands tremble as she took the envelope. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Your father made me swear. He said it was for your protection." Eleanor sighed deeply. "There's one more thing you need to know. On the night your father left, I overheard an argument between him and your Uncle Richard, something about compromising documents and a transfer that shouldn't have happened." The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted the conversation. Eleanor quickly disappeared among the plants, leaving Elizabeth alone with the envelope and even more questions. "Sorry I'm late." Gabriel appeared, adjusting his tie. His eyes immediately fell on the envelope in Elizabeth's hands. "What's that?" "Nothing important." She quickly tucked the envelope into her bag. "You said you had something to tell me about my father." Gabriel seemed to hesitate, running a hand through his graying hair. "First, I need you to understand my position. When we ended our engagement, it wasn't just because of the lies I told about my financial situation. And why was that? Your father came to me a week before he disappeared. He had discovered something about the companies, something big." Gabriel lowered his voice. "He asked me to investigate Richard discreetly, but I think your uncle found out. At the time, I was a coward. I distanced myself from everything, but I can't live with this guilt anymore. Why should I believe you now? Because I have proof." He pulled a flash drive from his pocket. "Here's everything I've discovered over the past 2 years. Richard isn't alone in this story, Elizabeth. There are powerful people involved, people who would do anything to keep their secrets." The sound of breaking glass echoed through the winter garden. Both turned quickly. A dark figure disappeared through the side door. "Someone was spying on us," Gabriel whispered, his face tense. "We need to get back to the party," Elizabeth decided, feeling the weight of the envelope in her bag. "Separately, you go first." After Gabriel left, Elizabeth allowed herself a moment to breathe. Eleanor's envelope, Gabriel's flash drive, the documents found with Nathan, they were pieces of a puzzle that was starting to take shape, but crucial elements were still missing. When she finally returned to the main hall, she noticed Richard, watching her with renewed interest. Her uncle raised his glass in her direction, smiling, but his eyes remained cold. Beside him, a man Elizabeth didn't recognize was taking notes on a phone. Outside, Shadow neighed again, a sharp, insistent sound that seemed to want to warn her about something. The night still held many secrets, and Elizabeth had a feeling that the next few hours would be decisive in uncovering the truth about her family. Elizabeth needed to find a safe place to examine the contents of the envelope Eleanor had given her. The bathroom in the main suite, on the second floor of the mansion, seemed like the best option at that moment. She locked herself inside, making sure she was truly alone. With trembling fingers, she carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter from her father, dated the day of his departure, and some old photographs. The familiar handwriting made her eyes well up. "My dear Elizabeth, if you are reading this letter, it means that the suspicions I have about Richard's activities have started to come to light. I can't explain everything here. The walls have ears, as I discovered in the worst possible way. But I need you to know that my departure was not a choice. It was a necessity. Richard is not alone in this conspiracy. 3 years ago, I discovered irregularities in the company's accounts. At first, I thought they were accounting errors, but I soon realized it was something much bigger. There is a network of powerful people using our companies for operations I prefer not to detail here. The photographs I included are from a meeting at our country house 15 years ago. Look closely at the faces in the images, especially the man next to Richard. He is the key to understanding everything. There is also a safe that Richard doesn't know about, hidden behind his grandmother's painting in the main office. The combination is your birth date, but backward. Inside, you will find all the evidence you need. Shadow has always been more than just a horse to our family. Your grandmother used to say he had a special gift for sensing danger. Trust his instincts, as I always have. I can't return now. It would be too risky. But know that every step I've taken has been to protect you and the honest legacy your grandmother built. When the time is right, we will meet again. With love, Dad." Elizabeth examined the photographs carefully. They were from a party at the country house 15 years ago. In one of them, Richard was talking to a man with a stern expression, the same man who had been by his side in the hall just minutes ago, taking notes on his phone. A detail in another photograph caught her attention. Gabriel, much younger, appeared in the background, watching the scene. Had he been involved with her family long before he met her? Why had he never mentioned it? Knocks on the door startled her. "Elizabeth?" It was her Aunt Margaret's voice. "Darling, Are you all right? Richard is looking for you. He said you need to make the main toast. I'm coming, Aunt, Elizabeth replied, quickly tucking the letter and photos into her bag. Her reflection in the mirror showed a woman different from the one who had started the party. Her eyes now carried the weight of her discoveries. As she left the bathroom, she nearly bumped into Nathan, who seemed to be waiting for her in the hallway. We need to talk, he whispered. I discovered something about your ex-fiancé that you need to know. Not now, Elizabeth replied in the same tone, but meet me in the main office in 20 minutes. I know where to find the evidence we need. She descended the stairs, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on her. Richard was waiting for her, in the center of the hall, glass in hand, smiling as if nothing in the world was wrong. Beside him, the man from the photograph watched her with renewed interest. Ah, finally, Richard exclaimed, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. Allow me to introduce. This is Dr. Victor Marshall, the new financial consultant for the Thompson Enterprises. Elizabeth shook Victor's hand, feeling a shiver run down her spine. His eyes were as cold as a snake about to strike. It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Miss Thompson, Victor said, his voice smooth as velvet. Your uncle speaks highly of you. Curious, Elizabeth replied, maintaining her social smile. He never mentioned you before. A sharp whinny cut through the night air, startling several guests. Shadow was agitated again. Through the hall windows, Elizabeth could see the horse rearing in its stall, as if trying to warn her about something. Is that animal still causing trouble? Victor commented, his voice dripping with disdain. Perhaps it's time to consider a more permanent solution. The way he emphasized the last word made Elizabeth's blood run cold. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Trust his instincts, as I always have. The toast proceeded like a well-rehearsed play. Richard gave an emotional speech about family tradition and the bright future awaiting the Thompson Enterprises. While Elizabeth smiled mechanically, her mind focused on the safe mentioned in her father's letter. As soon as she managed to extricate herself from the congratulations and photographs, she headed to the main office. The portrait of her grandmother dominated the wall behind the desk, an oil painting depicting her as a young woman mounted on a black horse that strongly resembled Shadow. Elizabeth had always admired the strength that emanated from that image. Your grandmother was an extraordinary woman. Eleanor's voice came from the doorway, startling her. She was the one who started the tradition of black horses in the family. They said they had a special connection with the Thompsons, that they could sense when something wasn't right. Eleanor, did you know about the safe? The housekeeper nodded. Your grandmother showed it to me once, just before she passed. She said that one day you would need it. She closed the door quietly. I'll keep watch. If anyone approaches, I'll cough twice. Elizabeth thanked her with a nod and turned her attention to the painting. It was heavy, but she managed to move it just enough to reveal the safe embedded in the wall. Her fingers trembled slightly as she entered the combination, her birth date in reverse. The safe opened with a soft click. Inside, there was a red folder stamped with the Thompson family's company logo and an old USB drive. She also found a brown envelope containing old photographs and a leather-bound journal. I knew I'd find you here. Gabriel's voice made her spin around. He was standing in the doorway connecting the office to the library, an unreadable expression on his face. How? The safe behind the painting? Your grandmother wasn't the only one who knew that secret. He stepped closer slowly. I was there when she had it installed 15 years ago. The photographs her father had left behind made even more sense now. You worked for my family before you met me. I was your grandmother's assistant for 2 years, Gabriel admitted. She was the one who first discovered irregularities in the companies just before her sudden passing. A noise in the hallway made Eleanor cough twice. Quickly, Elizabeth stashed the documents in her bag, but kept one of the photos in her hand, the one showing Gabriel at the country house. Why did you never tell me? Your grandmother made me promise to keep it a secret. She was gathering evidence against a group of powerful people, including Victor Marshall. Gabriel ran his hand nervously through his hair. When we met years later, I truly fell in love with you. But I also saw an opportunity to continue the investigation your grandmother started. Footsteps approached the office. Eleanor coughed again, more urgently this time. "We don't have much time," Gabriel whispered. "Victor isn't here just as a financial consultant. He came to make sure you signed some documents today during the party. Documents that would give Richard complete control over the companies." "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I promised your grandmother I would protect you, and I failed once when I walked away." His eyes met hers. "I won't fail again." The door opened, revealing Nathan. He looked from Elizabeth to Gabriel, his expression serious. "Sorry to interrupt, but we need to act fast." Nathan showed his phone. "I just got word. Victor is planning an emergency board meeting early tomorrow. They're going to vote on a complete restructuring of the companies." Elizabeth felt the weight of the documents in her bag. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, revealing a much bigger picture than she had imagined. Her grandmother had started an investigation, her father had continued it, and now it was up to her to finish it. Outside, Shadow neighed again. The sound seemed different. This time, not a warning, but a call. Elizabeth approached the window and saw something that made her heart race. A familiar figure was walking through the garden, partially hidden by the shadows of the trees. Elizabeth held her breath as she recognized the silhouette in the garden. Even at a distance and in the dim light, that distinctive way of walking was unmistakable. It was her father. He was there after 3 years of absence, like a ghost materializing among the ancient trees. "It's him, isn't it?" Gabriel asked softly, also watching through the window. Robert always had a dramatic sense of timing. "We need to go out." "There," Elizabeth said, already heading for the door, but Nathan stopped her. "Wait, look." He pointed to 2 figures moving in the shadows, following the trail her father had taken. "Victor brought company to the party." "Victor's men," Gabriel confirmed. "We need to be smarter." "Eleanor?" The housekeeper, who remained vigilant by the door, nodded silently. "There's an old passage that connects the wine cellar to the garden," Eleanor revealed. "It was used by the staff during your grandmother's grand events. I can take you there without anyone noticing." Elizabeth hesitated, glancing at the documents in her bag. "But what about the evidence?" "I'll take care of it," Nathan offered. "I have a prosecutor friend waiting for my call. As soon as he receives the documentation, he can start the legal proceedings." "No," Elizabeth decided. "We need the documents to confront Victor and Richard. Nathan, you and Gabriel will go find my father. I'll return to the party and keep everyone distracted." "It's too risky," Gabriel protested. "It's the only way. They must already be suspicious of my absence." Elizabeth took the flash drive from the safe in her bag and handed it to Nathan. "Here's the digital copy of the evidence. The originals stay with me if anything goes wrong." "Nothing will go wrong," Eleanor interrupted firmly. "Your grandmother always said you had the same fire in your eyes as she did. It's time to show what the Thompsons are truly made of." A sharp whinny from Shadow cut through the night again, as if agreeing with the housekeeper's words. "I'll take the boys through the passage," Eleanor continued. "You return to the main hall the usual way, but first..." She pulled a small silver brooch from her pocket, a finely crafted horse's head. "Your grandmother wore this during important moments. She said it brought clarity in times of decision." Elizabeth pinned the brooch to her dress, feeling the weight of the family history it carried. She took a deep breath, preparing to return to the party. 10 minutes, she agreed with Nathan and Gabriel. "Give me 10 minutes to distract Victor and Richard. Then follow Eleanor." Before leaving the office, Elizabeth took one last look at her grandmother's portrait. The woman in the painting seemed to stare back at her with a mix of pride and concern, mounted on her black horse beneath a stormy sky. The main hall was even more crowded when she returned. The orchestra was playing a soft waltz, and several couples were dancing in the center. Richard was animatedly chatting with a group of businessmen, gesturing with his champagne glass. "Ah, finally!" Victor materialized beside her like a shadow. "We were just talking about you. There are some documents we need to settle today." "Of course," Elizabeth smiled, channeling years of social training. "But first, how about a dance?" "After. All it's a party." Victor seemed to hesitate for a moment, but the calculated smile quickly returned to his face. "It would be an honor." As they danced, Elizabeth could feel the weight of the documents in her bag. Every turn of the waltz was a countdown. 1 minute less for Nathan and Gabriel to find her father, 1 minute closer to the confrontation that loomed ahead. "You know," Victor remarked casually during the dance, "your grandmother also loved to waltz. The last time we danced together was at a party much like this one, just before her misfortune." The tone of his voice made Elizabeth shiver, but she kept the smile on her face. Through the windows of the hall, she could see the full moon, illuminating the gardens. Somewhere out there, her father was waiting. In his stable, Shadow remained restless, as if sensing that the crucial moment was approaching. The waltz seemed endless. Every musical note marked precious seconds as Elizabeth kept Victor occupied on the dance floor. Her thoughts were in the gardens, where Nathan and Gabriel should have been following Eleanor through the secret passage at that very moment. "Very fitting, this brooch," Victor commented, his eyes fixed on the silver adornment. "Mary Elizabeth had one very similar. Your grandmother always was sentimental about horses. You seem to know a lot about my family," Elizabeth replied, studying his reactions. "Ah, yes, I met your grandmother when the Thompson companies were just a small construction firm." His smile didn't reach his eyes. She had big dreams, but sometimes dreams need realistic adjustments. The music shifted to a more intense tango. Victor led Elizabeth with a precision that revealed years of social practice. "You know," he continued, "there are decisions that need to be made for the greater good of the business. Your grandmother took a while to understand that. Your father, too. But you, Elizabeth..." He spun her abruptly, bringing their faces closer. "You seem more pragmatic." "And what decisions would those be?" "To start, those documents I mentioned. A small corporate restructuring, nothing more. Your Uncle Richard has been taking such good care of the business in recent years." A movement in the garden caught Elizabeth's attention. Through the large windows, she could see shadows moving among the trees. Her heart raced. "Why the rush?" she asked, trying to buy more time. "We could discuss this during the week, more calmly." "Oh, no," Victor smiled, but his eyes remained cold as ice. "Today is the perfect moment. All the important guests are already here, ready to witness. It would be a shame us to waste the opportunity." The veiled threat in his words was crystal clear. Elizabeth felt her grandmother's brooch weigh like lead on her dress. "Mr. Marshall," Richard's voice interrupted the dance. "Forgive me, but we need that signature now. The other advisors are waiting in the library." Elizabeth felt her blood run cold. The library, exactly where they shouldn't be going at that moment. "Uncle Richard," she interjected quickly, "couldn't we do this in the main office? The library is a mess after Shadow crashed the party." "No," Richard replied sharply, then softened his tone. "I mean, the library is more appropriate for this moment." A sharp whinny cut through the night, followed by sounds of commotion coming from the stables. The guests turned toward the noise, and Elizabeth took advantage of the distraction to take 2 steps back. "What is that animal up to?" "Now?" Victor asked irritably. "I'll check," Elizabeth offered, but Richard held her arm. "That can wait. We have more pressing matters to attend to." At that moment, Eleanor discreetly appeared at the entrance of the hall, giving a small nod, the agreed-upon signal. Her father had been found. "Actually," Elizabeth said, gently freeing herself from Richard's grip, "I believe we do have urgent matters to address, but not the ones you're imagining." She pulled the documents from her bag, holding them up so everyone could see the official seal of the Thompson companies. "Interesting how certain papers have the power to change everything, isn't it, Mr. Marshall?" Elizabeth continued, her voice calm but firm. "My grandmother knew that. My father did too, and now I finally understand why you were so desperate to get my signature today." Victor's face lost all color, while Richard took a step forward, his hands trembling slightly. "Elizabeth, you don't know what you're saying," her uncle began, but he was interrupted by a voice that made everyone turn. "On the contrary, Richard, she knows exactly what she's saying." Robert Thompson stood at the entrance of the hall, with Nathan and Gabriel by his side. The chatter among the guests ceased instantly. After 3 years of absence, the patriarch of the Thompson family had chosen that moment for his return. The silence that filled the room was almost palpable. Robert Thompson crossed the space with the same elegance and authority as always, as if not a single day had passed since he was last there. His hair was grayer, and new lines marked his face, but his eyes retained the same determined spark that Elizabeth knew so well. "Impossible," Victor murmured, his mask of composure beginning to crack. "You shouldn't be—" "Here," Robert completed, an ironic smile on his lips. "Or alive, Victor. Which of the two surprises you more?" Richard stepped forward, trying to maintain control of the situation. "Robert, my brother, what a wonderful surprise, but why all this drama?" "Spare me your false fraternal concern, Richard," Robert interrupted. "We passed the limits of social lies long ago." Elizabeth watched the scene, feeling the weight of the documents in her hands. The guests began to form a circle around them, sensing they were about to witness something extraordinary. "Ladies and gentlemen," Robert addressed the crowd, "I apologize for interrupting this celebration, but there are matters that need to be clarified. Matters that began 15 years ago when my mother, Mary Elizabeth Thompson, discovered irregularities in the family businesses." Victor made a move toward the exit, but Nathan and Gabriel had already discreetly blocked the main doors. "Mary Elizabeth was a woman ahead of her time," Robert continued. "She built this empire with integrity and vision, but she was also very observant. She was the first to notice the discrepancies, the shell companies, the money disappearing into non-existent consultancies." "Robert," Victor tried to interject, his voice tense, "this is neither the time nor the place." "On the contrary, Victor, this is exactly the time and place." Robert pulled an envelope from his jacket. "Do you know what these documents are? They are the originals my mother gathered, the same ones you thought you had destroyed the night she had her misfortune." A murmur swept through the room. Elizabeth felt her heart tighten, finally understanding the true extent of the conspiracy. "Father," she approached, showing the documents she had found in the safe. "I also found this. The signature, the power of attorney—" "Ah, yes," Robert took the document, displaying it to everyone. "A forged power of attorney, supposedly, granting me full authority to transfer control of the companies. Except I never signed this. It was quite a competent forgery, I must admit. But they made one mistake. They used a blue ink pen. I've always signed important documents with black ink, a tradition I inherited from my mother." Richard began to sweat visibly. "Robert, you're confused. These years away—" "Away?" Robert laughed humorlessly. "You mean hidden, Richard. Hidden because I discovered that you and Victor were planning to do to me what you did to our mother. But I was smarter, or perhaps more cowardly. I ran before you could reach me." Shadow neighed again, a sound that seemed to emphasize each revelation. Eleanor, who had been watching everything from a corner of the hall, wiped silent tears. "And do you know what's most interesting?" Robert continued, his voice heavy with restrained emotion. "All this time, while I gathered evidence and built a solid case, there was someone who never stopped believing that the truth would come to light. Someone who, even unknowingly, carried the same investigative spirit as her grandmother." He looked proudly at Elizabeth, who felt her grandmother's brooch as a source of strength on her chest. "It was Shadow who brought me back," Robert revealed. "When I learned he had crashed the party, I knew it was the sign I had been waiting for. Your grandmother always said the black horses of the family had a special gift. They sense when it's time for the truth to come out. Victor, who had until then maintained an appearance of calm, finally let his mask slip completely. "You have no proof of anything," he hissed. "These are just stories, conjectures from a man who abandoned his responsibilities." "Ah, but I have proof, Victor. All of it." Robert smiled, a smile that closely resembled his mother's. "And I'm not alone." If this story has intrigued you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit like. Tell us which city you're watching us from, and let's continue. As if responding to an invisible signal, the side doors of the hall opened. Through them entered three people whom Elizabeth recognized immediately. The prosecutor Nathan had mentioned, accompanied by two federal police investigators. "Gentlemen," the prosecutor announced, his voice echoing through the hall, "I regret to interrupt the festivities, but we have urgent matters to discuss with Mr. Victor Marshall and Mr. Richard Thompson." Victor looked around like a cornered animal, while Richard seemed to have aged 10 years in the last few minutes. Over the past 3 years, Robert continued, every document, every suspicious transaction, every move you made has been meticulously recorded. Not just by me, but by a network of people committed to the truth. Gabriel stepped forward, including some you thought you had bought. He pulled a recorder from his pocket. All our conversations from the past few months are here, Victor, including the one where you described in detail how you forged the power of attorney. And don't forget the digital evidence, Nathan added, holding up the flash drive Elizabeth had given him. Every irregular transfer, every shell company, every misappropriated penny is documented here. Elizabeth watched the scene unfold like a movie. The pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place. Her father hadn't fled out of cowardice, but to protect the family and gather evidence. Gabriel hadn't truly betrayed her. His distance had been part of a larger plan. Even Nathan, the supposed journalist, was actually an undercover investigator. "Ma'am," one of the officers approached Elizabeth. "We found this in Mr. Marshall's office." He handed her a folder. "These are the original documents he planned to have you sign today." Elizabeth opened the folder and felt a chill. It was a complete set of papers that, once signed, would transfer full control of the companies to a holding controlled by Victor and Richard. "How could you?" She turned to her uncle, the hurt evident in her voice. "After everything Grandma did for our family." "You don't understand," Richard replied, his arrogance finally giving way to desperation. The business needed to change, to adapt. Mary Elizabeth was too inflexible. Her rules, her outdated ethics. "Outdated ethics?" Robert interrupted, his voice filled with indignation. "Is that how you define honesty and integrity, Richard? Our mother built an empire based on solid principles, but you—" He looked at Victor with disdain. "You only saw numbers, profits at any cost." Eleanor quietly approached Elizabeth, holding her hand in support. Outside, Shadow had calmed down as if knowing his mission was complete. "Mr. Marshall, Mr. Thompson," the prosecutor formally announced, "you are detained for questioning on suspicion of fraud, document forgery, and other crimes that will be properly investigated." As the investigators led Victor and Richard out of the hall, the guests began to disperse, murmuring among themselves. Some seemed shocked, others strangely satisfied, as if they had suspected something for a long time. Robert turned to his daughter, his eyes brimming with tears. "Forgive me for leaving that way without explanations, but it was the only way to—" Elizabeth hugged him before he could finish the sentence. "I understand, Dad. Now I understand everything." The brooch on her dress sparkled under the lights of the hall, as if Mary Elizabeth Thompson were also there, witnessing the moment when the truth finally came to light. "Your grandmother would be proud," Eleanor commented softly. "She always said you had the same fire in your eyes as she did. The same instinct to distinguish right from wrong." Gabriel approached the group. "Elizabeth, Later," she gently interrupted him. "We'll have time for all the explanations." The following hours passed like a whirlwind. Most of the guests had already left, leaving the main hall nearly empty. Only a few people remained: the family, some close friends, and those who had helped unravel the entire plot. Elizabeth was sitting in the library with her father, the place where it had all begun that night. Her grandmother's portrait seemed to watch them with a new meaning now. "Why didn't you reach out to me sooner?" Elizabeth asked, holding a cup of tea that Eleanor had prepared. "All these years," Robert sighed deeply. "Believe me, daughter, it was the hardest decision I've ever made. But Victor had people everywhere. If I had tried to contact you, they would have known. And then," he hesitated, "I couldn't risk you meeting the same fate as your grandmother. So it's true. What happened to Grandma wasn't natural." "We don't have concrete proof," Robert replied, his voice choked. "Victor was very careful, but she started gathering evidence against him, documents that proved his embezzlement. A week later, she had a sudden illness during breakfast. Eleanor, who was quietly organizing some nearby books, wiped away a tear. "I was the one who found her that morning," she said softly. Her teacup was still half full. "That's why you ran away," Elizabeth realized. "When you discovered the same irregularities, Yes, but I didn't run just to protect myself. I needed time and distance to gather evidence, build a support network, and prepare everything for this moment. Robert smiled sadly. Gabriel was crucial in that process. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Gabriel appeared at the library door. He seemed hesitant, more vulnerable than Elizabeth had ever seen him. "May I come in?" Elizabeth nodded and Eleanor discreetly withdrew, leaving the three of them alone. "I owed you an explanation a long time ago," Gabriel began, sitting down, in a nearby armchair. "When we met, I was already helping your father. He was the one who asked me to get close to make sure you were safe." "But the feelings," Elizabeth asked, her voice betraying a hint of hurt. "They were real," Gabriel replied without hesitation. "So real that I almost compromised the entire operation. When I realized I was truly falling in love, I knew I had to step back. I couldn't risk Victor finding out, using our relationship against us." Nathan entered the library at that moment carrying a folder. "Sorry to interrupt, but I thought you'd want to know. The prosecutor just called. Richard's confession is complete. He told everything, even about—" He hesitated, glancing at Robert. "About Mary Elizabeth?" Robert asked, though he seemed to already know the answer. Nathan nodded. "Victor planned it all. The poison was undetectable at the time, mixed into the morning tea. Richard knew, but he never had the courage to confess until now." Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. The brooch on her dress seemed to weigh a ton. "Shadow knew," she murmured. "That's why he was so restless today. He sensed. Your grandmother always said the black horses in the family had a special gift," Robert confirmed. "When I heard that Shadow had stormed into the party, causing all that chaos, I knew it was time to act. He's always been more than an animal. He's a guardian of the Thompson family." Outside, as if responding to Robert's words, Shadow whinnied softly. The night was already deep, and the full moon bathed the gardens in its silvery light. "And now," Elizabeth asked, looking at her father, "how do we rebuild all of this?" "Together," Robert replied simply, "as your grandmother always wanted. With honesty, integrity, and black horses to guide us," Elizabeth added, smiling for the first time in hours. Nathan cleared his throat softly. "There's one more thing you need to see." He opened his briefcase, revealing a set of old documents. "I found this in Victor's archives. These are Mary Elizabeth's original plans for the companies. She had an incredible vision for the future, sustainable projects, social responsibility, everything decades ahead of its time." The sun was beginning to rise on the horizon when Elizabeth finally allowed herself a moment of rest. The night that had started as a celebration of her birthday had turned into a journey of discoveries and revelations that would forever change the destiny of the Thompson family. On the mansion's balcony, watching the sunrise, she was accompanied by her father, Gabriel, Nathan, and Eleanor. Shadow grazed peacefully in the garden as if nothing extraordinary had happened. "These plans from Grandma," Elizabeth commented, flipping through the documents Nathan had found, "are absolutely brilliant. She planned to transform the Thompson companies into a model of ethical and sustainable business." "Your grandmother was always ahead of her time," Eleanor remarked, serving fresh coffee for everyone. "She used to say that profit without purpose was like a rose without fragrance, beautiful on the outside but lacking essence. And now we have the chance to fulfill that vision," Robert added, his eyes shining with renewed energy. "With Victor and Richard out of the way, we can rebuild the companies following the principles she established." Gabriel approached Elizabeth hesitantly. "If you'll allow me, I'd like to help with this rebuilding. Not as your—" He hesitated. "Well, just as someone who believes in the project." Elizabeth studied him for a moment. The hurt was still there. But now it was different, understandable, perhaps even necessary for what had happened. "I think the Thompson companies can use all the hands available," she replied diplomatically. "Besides, you've proven your loyalty to the family." Nathan cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "Well, technically my mission is complete, but—" He smiled, adjusting his glasses. "If you need someone to handle corporate communications, I know a former investigative journalist who's looking for new challenges." Everyone laughed, the tension from recent events finally beginning to dissipate. You know, Robert said, watching Shadow in the garden, your grandmother had an interesting theory about the family's black horses. She said they weren't just animals, they were guardians, chosen to protect not only the Thompson family, but also their values, their principles. Like Shadow did tonight, Elizabeth added, touching the brooch on her dress. Exactly. And now, looking back, I realize that every crucial moment in our family's history has had the presence of one of them. Robert smiled. Even my escape, it was Shadow who warned me that night, becoming restless in a way I had never seen before. Eleanor approached with an old box that Elizabeth had never seen before. I found this in your grandmother's room, kept all these years. I think now is the right time for you to have it. Inside the box was a leather-bound journal with the initials M.E.T. embossed in gold. Alongside it, an old photograph showed her grandmother, young and smiling, riding a black horse identical to Shadow. Midnight, Eleanor explained. The first of the black horses. It was with him that your grandmother began building all of this. Elizabeth opened the journal with reverent care. On the first page, a message written in her grandmother's elegant handwriting. To my granddaughter Elizabeth, when you read these words, you will know the right time to use them. The Thompson legacy is not in the buildings we constructed or the wealth we accumulated, but in the values we chose to uphold. Trust the Black Guardians. They will never abandon you. With eternal love, Grandma Mary Elizabeth. Shadow approached the porch at that moment, his presence as commanding as ever. Elizabeth noticed that he was no longer restless or agitated. His eyes were calm, as if his mission had been fulfilled. And now, Nathan asked, watching the sun rise on the horizon. Now, Elizabeth replied, feeling the strength of generations, of Thompson women flowing through her veins. We begin to rebuild, not just the businesses, but the legacy my grandmother always dreamed of. A week after the events of the birthday celebration, the Thompson mansion had regained its usual tranquility. The garden, once decorated for the grand celebration, now displayed only its natural beauty. In the main office, Elizabeth was bent over her grandmother's blueprints, studying every detail with meticulous attention. I found something interesting, Nathan announced, entering the office with an old folder. After accepting the invitation to lead the communication for the Thompson family businesses, he had immersed himself in the family archives with his characteristic investigative zeal. These are your grandmother's original studies for a sustainable, social housing project. She was decades ahead of her time. Elizabeth picked up the documents, marveling at Mary Elizabeth's vision. The plans detailed self-sustaining residential complexes, complete with solar energy, community gardens, and rainwater harvesting systems. This is incredible, she murmured, running her fingers over the technical drawings. Victor and Richard shelved all of this to build luxury condominiums that yielded more immediate profit. And now? Nathan asked, sitting down across the table. Now we're going to make her dream come true, Elizabeth smiled, determined. I've already spoken to Dad. We're restructuring the Special Projects Department to focus exclusively on sustainable development and social impact. Eleanor entered the office carrying a tray with tea and cookies. Your grandmother used to say that a company without social conscience was like a garden without flowers. It might be functional, but it lacked soul. Speaking of gardens, Nathan commented, looking out the window. Shadow seems different since that night, more serene. It was true. The black horse, which had once been so restless, now roamed peacefully through the mansion gardens, as if its mission had been fulfilled. Black Guardians know when their work is done, Eleanor said with a mysterious smile. Now it's time to build the future. Robert entered the office at that moment, accompanied by Gabriel. Both were carrying folders and seemed excited. Elizabeth, her father called, I think we've found something you need to see. He opened one of the folders on the table. These are records of other social projects your grandmother developed in secret. She used a portion of her personal profits to fund schools in underserved communities. And that's not all, Gabriel added. She had a scholarship program for talented young architects and engineers, Many of the best professionals in the market today started their careers thanks to her. Elizabeth felt her eyes well up. Each new discovery about her grandmother revealed an even deeper dimension of her vision and humanity. "I found this too," Eleanor said, pulling a yellowed envelope from her apron. It was kept with her things. "It's a letter for you," but she specified that it should only be delivered when the time was right. "I think now is that moment." With trembling hands, Elizabeth opened the envelope. The letter was dated just a few days before her grandmother's passing. "My dear Elizabeth, if you are reading this letter, it means the truth has finally come to light and our guardians have fulfilled their mission. I know the path hasn't been easy, but sometimes we need to lose something precious to find something even more valuable, our true essence. The Thompson companies were never just about building structures or accumulating wealth. Our true mission has always been to build bridges between people, between dreams and reality, between the present and a more just and sustainable future. Shadow is not just a horse, just as Midnight was not just my companion. They are physical manifestations of our conscience, our moral guardians. When something is wrong, they sense it. When the path is lost, they guide us back. I entrust to you not only the future of the companies, but most importantly, their values and principles. Use them with wisdom and courage. And always remember, true power lies not in controlling others, but in empowering them to achieve their own dreams. With eternal love, Grandma Mary Elizabeth." A soft whinny from Shadow echoed through the garden, as if he were approving every word of the letter. Elizabeth wiped away a tear, feeling the weight and honor of that legacy. 3 months had passed since the night of the birthday party. The headquarters of the Thompson companies had undergone a transformation, not just administratively, but philosophically. Elizabeth's office, once decorated with expensive artwork and imposing furniture, now displayed her grandmother's social projects framed on the walls. "The first sustainable project will be inaugurated in 6 months," Gabriel announced during a morning meeting. His relationship with Elizabeth had found a new balance, no longer romantic, but based on mutual respect and commitment to Mary Elizabeth's vision. "And we already have a waiting list for the scholarship program," Nathan added, consulting his tablet. As the communications director, he had transformed the image of the Thompson companies, focusing not just on their ventures, but primarily on their social impact. Robert, who was chairing the meeting, smiled with pride. "Your grandmother always said that real change begins with small, determined steps." "Speaking of changes," Eleanor gently interrupted, entering the room, "there's something you all need to see at the stables." The group followed the housekeeper to the stables, where a surprising scene awaited them. Shadow was not alone in his stall. By his side, a mare as black as night rested peacefully. "She appeared this morning," Eleanor explained. "No one knows where she came from. The caretakers say she was just there, as if she had always belonged to this place." "Stella," Elizabeth murmured, the name naturally coming to her mind. "Her name is Stella." "How do you know?" Nathan asked, intrigued. "I can't explain it," Elizabeth said, moving closer to the pair of horses. "It's as if she was destined to be here. As if the guardians were multiplying," Robert added softly. "Your grandmother always said that when the family found its true path again, new guardians would emerge." Shadow and Stella seemed perfectly in sync, their black coats gleaming under the sunlight streaming through the stable windows. It was as if a new era was beginning for the Thompson family. "I found something else in the old archives," Nathan remarked, pulling an envelope from the folder he was carrying. "These are photographs of all the black horses that have ever belonged to the family. Midnight, Mrs. Mary Elizabeth's horse, was the first. Then came others, always at crucial moments in the Thompsons' history." Elizabeth examined the photographs with interest. In each one, the black horses seemed to have the same deep, mysterious gaze that characterized Shadow. "They're not just animals. They're symbols," Eleanor said gently. "Symbols of integrity, purpose, and connection to something greater than ourselves." "And now we have 2, Gabriel observed, Shadow and Stella. "Because now is the time to grow," Robert explained, "not just in size or profits, but in positive impact on the world. That's what your grandmother always wanted, Elizabeth. A company that went far beyond business." An employee hurried over to the group. Miss Thompson, the families from the social housing pilot project have arrived for the meeting. Elizabeth smiled, adjusting the horse brooch she no longer took off her chest. Let's welcome them in the main meeting room. It's time to show that Grandma's dreams are more alive than ever. Before leaving the stable, she cast one last glance at Shadow and Stella. The two black horses watched her with that ancient wisdom that seemed to transcend human understanding. It was as if they knew exactly what the future held for the Thompson family. You know, Eleanor commented as they walked back to the mansion, your grandmother used to say that black horses are like stars on a moonless night. They guide our way even in the darkest hours. And now we have two stars guiding us, Elizabeth replied, feeling a deep certainty that, at last, the Thompson family was on the right path. A year had passed since the night that changed everything. The Thompson mansion was once again decorated for a party, but this time the atmosphere was entirely different. There was no ostentation or excessive luxury, just simple elegance and purpose. It was the official inauguration of the Mary Elizabeth Thompson Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to realizing the social projects dreamed of by its founder. The garden was illuminated with soft lights, and in place of rare orchids, native flowers adorned the setting. Elizabeth observed the guests from the top of the main staircase. They were no longer just business people and socialites. There were students benefiting from the scholarship program, families from the housing project, teachers, researchers, and environmental activists. Your grandmother would be proud, Eleanor said, approaching with teary eyes. The housekeeper was now the director of the foundation's social program, a role she carried out with passionate dedication. She is here, Elizabeth replied, touching the brooch on her blazer. In some way, she always has been. Robert stepped onto the small stage set up in the garden, accompanied by Nathan and Gabriel. The former journalist and the former fiancé had become fundamental pillars in the new structure of the Thompson enterprises, each contributing their unique skills to bring Mary Elizabeth's vision to life. Good evening, everyone, Robert began his speech. A year ago, this family faced its darkest night. But as my mother always said, sometimes we must go through the darkness to find our true light. Shadow and Stella grazed peacefully in a specially prepared enclosure near the garden. The two black horses had become living symbols of the Thompsons' transformation. To everyone's surprise, Stella was expecting a foal. The third generation of guardians was on its way. The projects we inaugurate today, Robert continued, are not just buildings or social programs. They are seeds of hope, planted many years ago by a woman who saw beyond her time. Elizabeth descended the stairs, joining the guests. A young architecture student approached her, eyes shining with emotion. Miss Thompson, I wanted to thank you. The scholarship changed my life. And now with the opportunity to work on sustainable projects, the credit is yours, Elizabeth smiled. We merely opened the doors. You are the one building your own path. Nathan approached with his tablet. Social media is flooded with messages about the foundation. Mrs. Mary Elizabeth's story has become an inspiration for entrepreneurs across the country. As she always wanted, Eleanor remarked, to show that it's possible to do business with soul. A soft whinny caught everyone's attention. Shadow and Stella had approached the fence, their black coats gleaming under the garden lights. For a moment, Elizabeth felt as though she saw the image of her grandmother reflected in the deep eyes of the horses. You know what moves me the most? Gabriel commented, stepping closer to the group. Seeing how the staff has changed. It's no longer just a job for them, it's a mission. Because now they're part of something bigger, Robert replied. Something that goes beyond money or power. Elizabeth stepped onto the stage for her own speech. Looking out at the diverse crowd filling the garden, she felt the weight of the legacy she carried, not as a burden, but as an honor. A year ago, I thought I knew what it meant to be a Thompson, she began. I thought it was about tradition, power, and responsibility. But my grandmother, through her letters, her projects, and yes, through our black guardians, taught me that being a Thompson is so much more than that. She paused, glancing at Shadow and Stella. It's about building bridges where others see walls. It's about finding opportunities to do good where others see only profit. It's about honoring the past while building a better future. Above, the first stars began to twinkle, as if even nature wanted to be part of this moment of celebration. Shadow and Stella moved in perfect sync, drawing even closer to the fence where Elizabeth was speaking. "Our story isn't over," she continued, her voice filled with emotion. "In fact, it's just beginning. Every completed project, every family, helped, every dream realized is a new page in the story my grandmother started writing so many years ago." Eleanor, watching from the front row, held Mary Elizabeth's diary in her hands. On the last pages, a phrase written by the Thompson matriarch seemed to shine with new strength. "True success isn't measured by what we achieve for ourselves, but by what we leave for others." A movement in the paddock drew everyone's attention. Stella, the black mare who had arrived so mysteriously, approached the fence with gentle steps. Her belly, carrying the future guardian of the family, glistened under the garden lights. Shadow followed closely behind, protective and majestic as ever. "Look at our guardians," Elizabeth pointed out, her voice trembling with emotion. "They're not just extraordinary animals. They're living symbols of everything we stand for: strength, integrity, loyalty, and above all the ability to keep moving forward, even in the hardest times." Robert joined his daughter on stage, followed by Nathan, Gabriel, and Eleanor. Together, they represented not just the continuation of the Thompsons, but the fulfillment of Mary Elizabeth's dream, a company that would be so much more than a business empire. "And so," Elizabeth concluded, her voice echoing through the illuminated garden, "I invite all of you to be part of this new journey, because the legacy of the Thompsons does not belong solely to our family. It belongs to everyone who believes it is possible to build a better, fairer, and more sustainable future." The final words were met with emotional applause. Shadow and Stella whinnied softly, as if approving every word. In the sky, the stars shone with renewed intensity, silent witnesses to a story that, as Elizabeth had said, was only just beginning. If this story intrigued you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit like. Let us know which city you're watching from, and stay tuned.